According to the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden was a paradise planted by God himself, overflowing with beauty and abundance. It was said to be watered by a single river that split into 4 mighty streams, flowing through lands rich with gold, bdellium, and onyx. Every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food grew there, including the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The air would have been pure and fragrant, the light soft and golden, the earth vibrant with colour and life. Milton describes it in Paradise Lost as so lovely fair was paradise, the seat of man's first bliss and source of human race. Perhaps one of the greatest tragedies in the Bible is that despite having been created for mankind, no man outside of Adam would ever get to behold such a place. As we know from the narrative, Adam and Eve were deceived by the serpent and were banished from the garden for having committed the one transgression that God had asked them not to. Eden completely disappeared from the narrative thereafter. It isn't longed for, it isn't fought over, and it never becomes a place that the biblical characters seem to even want to return to. In fact, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they were completely ignorant of its existence in the first place, given that none of them ever mention it. The fascination with the place, therefore, appears to be a more modern invention, with many questioning where Eden was in the times after Adam and Eve's expulsion, why no one ever sought to return there, if only to acquire the fruit, and whether or not the sanctuary was able to endure the Great Deluge. Today we'll be looking at why a return to Eden would have been virtually impossible for the biblical characters, and discussing some ideas as to why this luscious paradise seemed to just disappear as if overnight. In the Genesis account, we understand that after Adam and Eve have been tempted by the serpent and eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they are banished from Eden and exiled to dwell in the barren landscape of the earth, fending for themselves on the now cursed ground. Where man had once enjoyed the trees and fruits for nourishment in the garden, he now had nothing and was forced to work the infertile ground outside of the garden for mere thorns and thistles. Ultimately, the banishment from the garden occurred as punishment for having betrayed God in the first place. But as we later learn in chapter 3 of Genesis, God also implies precautions to prevent man from ever returning to it. Indeed, man had been curious enough to sample from the tree of knowledge. Now that he had that knowledge, it would only be logical that he would wish now to sample from another forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life. The Bible tells us, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." Evidently, from this verse, we can see that God did anticipate mankind trespassing their way back to the sacred land. Instead of allowing this to transpire and then punishing the culprits who tried, God establishes his own form of security for the garden so as to prevent the theft of the fruit of the tree of life. Genesis tells us, after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, this is all Genesis has to tell us of the security guards around the perimeter of Eden, and interestingly, this is pretty much the last time that Eden is ever really mentioned again. Indeed, no other biblical character appears to inquire as to where Eden is, and there prove to be no attempts by anyone to even try to sneak their way back in. Even with the hallowed fruit that would grant anyone immortality up for grabs, no one is willing to risk crossing the cherubim in order to get it. This gives the impression that the guards of this sanctuary really were quite terrifying if they were able to decentivize would-be thieves so effectively. Remember, in the times of Noah, the world was full of so much sin and debauchery that you might say that people weren't really all that afraid of God. They worshipped other gods, engaged in adulterous lifestyles, and even killed each other in cold blood. Yet one thing even the most wicked of men aren't seen to do is make a play for the Garden of Eden. Now, one might argue that by Noah's time, the garden had either been forgotten or had fallen into such a state of decay that there was no tree of life anymore, and thus the gods were no longer necessary. But a common belief, and because the Bible doesn't say otherwise, is that the garden and the tree of life were still intact, but that the cherubim were so fearsome that even the worst of mankind just left it well the hell alone. Genesis doesn't give us a description of the cherubim. In fact, we don't get a description of them until chapter 10 of the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel describes seeing them in a vision. It is from such an account that one might grasp just why Eden appeared to have 0 attempts of infiltration, because the cherubim detailed here might truly have been considered to be the stuff of nightmares, and their whole body and their backs and their heads and their wings were full of eyes round about. Ezekiel subsequently adds, "And every one had 4 faces. The first face was the face of a cherub, and the second face was the face of a man, and the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle." Ezekiel's account has some of the most foreboding and alarming imagery in the entire Bible, especially when it comes to describing the cherubs. Indeed, these multi-headed creatures are a far cry from the gentle, childlike angels commonly seen in later art, but are much more akin to monsters found in a fantasy story. According to Ezekiel, beneath them, wheels within wheels spin and burn with fiery brilliance, alive with the same dreadful intelligence as the cherubs themselves. The sound of their wings is like the roar of an army or the crashing of some mighty waters. To behold such creatures is to glimpse the raw machinery of heaven itself, something that's alien, overwhelming, and utterly beyond human comprehension. Why, Ezekiel himself can barely hold his head up long enough to behold them in their entirety, and this was a man who meant no harm. Can you then imagine the reality for someone who had found the courage to hop over the fence of Eden, and who had then incurred the wrath of one of these cherubim? These creatures were daunting to a faithful and righteous man as Ezekiel, and their neutrality was enough to have him all but cowering in fear of them. Therefore, one who had transgressed and was violating the grounds of which the cherubim were employed to guard would surely be in for more than just a shock to the system. We aren't told in Genesis what sort of power the cherubim were permitted to use against potential trespassers. It would seem that their mere presence was enough to deter all would-be offenders, as perhaps per God's intention. Yet the mind does wander on this one to the potentiality that if someone did jump the fence and did attempt to tackle the cherubim, would the angelic guards simply escort them out, or would they kill them? I suppose there's more evidence to suggest that it would be the latter. Why else would the cherubim have such violent weapons as flaming swords? The message behind such imagery was thus very clear. Infiltrating Eden after Adam's expulsion was tantamount to jumping headfirst off a cliff. There could only be one outcome: death. We later see Ezekiel's description of the cherubim go hand in hand with the account of Revelation, where we are told, "In the center, around the throne, were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes, in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third had a face like a man, the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under its wings." If we look closely at verse 24 of Genesis 3, we see that God drives out Adam and Eve and places at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim with their flaming swords. This has since given rise to an idea that only the east side of Eden was actually guarded, and that if one really wanted to get back in there, all they had to do was approach from a different angle. But if this was the case, then it's reasonable to believe that someone over the course of Adam's genealogy would have at least attempted to have done this. Of course, the Bible makes no record of this, and because there isn't anyone who lives forever, it can be safely assumed that any attempt to return and procure the fruit of the tree of life was unsuccessful. In one interpretation, God's placing of cherubim on the east side of Eden would have been their starting point only. They weren't fixed to the east side, but merely began their patrol there. Because we get the pluralized form of cherub, cherubim, there would have to have been at least 2 of them on duty, perhaps lapping the south, west and north sides too on their rotations. If there were more than 2, well then that just makes infiltration all the more difficult, because the window for entry would naturally become much smaller. In some interpretations, the cherubim placed around Eden are countless, and there is simply no way back to the Tree of Life without encountering the quadruple-headed sentinels. Another possibility is that the east side of Eden is akin to Eden being placed in the east, as told to us in Genesis 2:8. Now the Lord God planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. Ergo, if Eden was in the east, then the cherubim guarding the east would make sense. Essentially, with this interpretation, the cherubim guarding the east simply meant that the cherubim were guarding the entirety of wherever Eden was located. Put simply, no matter what way you slice it up, no one was getting back to Eden whilst the cherubim were left on patrol. One popular theory, particularly in early Jewish and Christian traditions, posits that the Garden of Eden was destroyed after Adam and Eve's expulsion. This theory is rooted in the idea that the fall brought a fundamental change to the world, where the sin of disobedience not only affected humanity, but also the entire created order, corrupting the natural world and leading to the eventual destruction of the garden. Some interpretations suggest that the flood in the time of Noah, described in Genesis 6:9, may have wiped out Eden. The flood, which covered the entirety of the earth, could have submerged the garden and erased it from existence. This theory is supported by the fact we've already established, that after the flood, no one ever mentions Eden again, and that as a result of the deluge destruction, it's plausible that the landscape of the world may have changed dramatically. If Eden had been located in a region affected by the flood, such as Mesopotamia or the Persian Gulf, according to some geographical theories, it's entirely possible for it to have been uprooted and or eroded by the rising waters. This is corroborated by the account in the Apocryphal Books of Baruch, where it is said that the garden was lost in the flood. When God brought the flood, the water entered paradise and killed every flower. This idea is bolstered by the association of Eden with a sort of primordial perfection, a state of existence that was lost when sin was brought into the world. After the fall, we get the notion that the earth became a more hostile place, subject to decay, death, and violence. As a result, Eden, as a perfect garden, could not therefore continue to exist in a world that had become tainted by such afflictions. Another idea is that without Adam tending to the garden, as was his duty, the garden would eventually perish on its own. We aren't given the idea that the garden was self-sustaining, in fact, quite the opposite. Why else would God deputize Adam into being the one who looks after the place? There's an argument here that Adam's care for the garden was so essential that he even needed a helper in Eve in order to ensure that the garden would continue to flourish. So if suddenly the only 2 people who were maintaining the garden were booted out of it, chances are that the garden was left to decline, and like any neglected garden, was soon overcome by weeds and local wildlife. An alternative theory is that the Garden of Eden was not destroyed or left to deteriorate, but instead hidden from human view. This theory is rooted in the belief that Eden remains intact but is inaccessible, perhaps as a result of God still wanting to keep man out. The cherub and its flaming sword in Genesis is often cited as evidence that Eden is being actively guarded, indicating that it still exists somewhere, but that obviously no one has found it. But then it does beg the question that if it's so hidden, then why does it require such an ominous guard? One idea is that God isn't taking any chances. He doesn't want man to unknowingly stumble upon the garden and then get unceremoniously shish kebabbed by a cherub and the flaming sword. On the other hand, it might lend to how thorough God is and emphasize just how much he wants for paradise and man to remain separated, perhaps until it's earned. According to the Tree of Souls, a compendium containing a vast amount of Jewish myth, One suggestion is that the Garden of Eden is closed on every side, and that it is guarded in a number of ways so that no one can see it. Not even the angels or the prophets are able to perceive it. It is remarked in the work that just as a nut is enclosed within a shell, so Eden is a world within. In the apocryphal work, the first book of Adam and Eve, otherwise known by its wordier title, The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, the narrative picks up after Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, covering their struggles, temptations, and the events leading up to Cain killing Abel. From the onset, the narrative deviates from its biblical counterpart, giving us some interesting nuances about the actual creation of the world. We are told that it was on the third day that God planted the Garden of Eden in the east of the earth, and that beyond this garden there was nothing but water, an expansive ocean that encompassed the whole world and even reached the borders of heaven. Indeed, already, the narrative showcases something different than what the common believer would come to expect. Biblically speaking, God didn't create the garden until after the seventh day, where the world itself had already been created, and the waters and the sky had already been given their places. Yet in this narrative, we are led to believe that the garden was the primordial land, the very first mass of earth that was placed in the easternmost area amongst an endless ocean. One finds nothing but water that encompasses the whole world, the text reads, signifying the utter barrenness of the world except for these very waters and the small chunk of land that God had now caused to emerge. Now, of this water, we are told that it was clear and pure to the taste. It was unlike anything else we know of today in terms of its purity, and had such divine properties that one could see the depths of the earth just by staring into it. Furthermore, we are told that if a man was to wash himself in these waters, he would become clean, not just of body, but of all sin, regardless of how evil he had once been. This, we are told, was the Crystal Sea, a primordial sea that God had made with the sole purpose of allowing humanity to bathe and cleanse themselves of any wrongs they had committed. Just as they washed away dirt from their bodies, so too could the wickedness of their deeds and actions be washed away too. Whilst the canonical Bible does not explicitly mention such a crystal sea, there are passages that do describe similar imagery found much later in the book of Revelation. The Apostle John witnesses a sea of glass in his visions, telling us in two accounts that also in front of the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. And then again, and I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast. Interestingly, the book of Adam and Eve even goes as far as to tell us why such an ocean was created by God in the first place. And here we learn that this was for his own good pleasure, a poetic irony that God could later himself enjoy. You see, the text tells us here that God knew Adam would end up transgressing, and he knew that he would boot Adam from the garden after the great disobedience took place. In a way, the text almost styles this creation of the waters as a cruel quip by God, who lets it be known to his creation that there is a cure for their sin, but the only way to get there is to venture north of the Garden of Eden, where man is barred from entering. With this elaborate scheme, it does beg the question, was humanity set up to fail? Indeed, God is seen here to have created the crystal sea before Adam and Eve sinned. The text also tells us that God knew Adam was going to sin, yet he never grants him access to the waters that would have saved him, but in a way lords it over him, allowing him to know of its existence, but never giving him the opportunity to redeem himself. In that way, it might be said that man and Adam were made to suffer, the cure dangled almost ungraciously before our faces, yet forever out of reach, a constant reminder of our original sin. The text tells us, he did not place Adam on the border of Eden northward. This was so that he and Eve would not be able to go near the water where they could wash themselves in it, be cleansed from their sins, erase the transgression they had committed, and be no longer reminded of it in the thought of their punishment. In the subsequent chapter of this work, Adam and Eve are made to give the walk of shame out of Eden, and whilst the Bible is never that detailed about their actual exit from the garden, this apocryphal work tells us that Adam passed by the fateful tree of knowledge, but that now God had changed its appearance so that it had shriveled up into a dead, macabre remnant of its former glory. On his way out, he also comes face to face with one of the cherubs with a sword of fire, and that when they locked eyes, the cherub grew so angry at him for having disappointed God that he and Eve both fell on their faces and trembled with fear. This echoes my earlier point of how petrifying and diabolical these angels could appear. For if Ezekiel was horrified by them when he was merely observing them from a safe distance, you can only imagine what it's like to have been berated by one, or worse, attacked by one. Adam goes through such an experience in this apocryphal work and appears to be so terrified of the creature that he and his wife just resort to falling on their faces before it. This encounter has such a profound effect on the couple that the cherub actually begins to feel bad in this narrative, and he shows pity on them. We are told that he went up to heaven to converse with God and told him, "Lord, you sent me to watch at the gate of the garden with a sword of fire, but when your servants Adam and Eve saw me, they fell on their faces and were as dead." When God sees this in this narrative, he too feels bad for his children and thus has pity on them. The text tells us that he shows them mercy and that he sent this very cherub to keep the garden thereafter. With the word keep, it kinda gives the impression that this angel fulfills less of a guard's role and adopts more of the role that Adam had as a caretaker. Various Jewish traditions paint the Garden of Eden in various different lights. Not only does the nature of the garden differ, but so too does its fate, with some suggesting it was hidden, some suggesting it was destroyed, and others implying that it was never real in the first place, but rather more of a symbolic landscape representing paradise. In the Kabbalah, for example, the garden was never an actual physical location, but rather a mystical one, very possibly something akin to an eternal state, which one can reach by some mystical means. In his commentary of Genesis 2, Rabbi Moshe Alshek describes the Garden of Eden as a supernatural place, and that if one was to take a branch or leaf out of the place, it would degrade into a regular leaf or branch. The moral of this is that even if one did reach the Garden of Eden, you could never bring anything out of there, for whatever was taken would lose its divinity upon one's exit. Perhaps one's memory upon leaving the place would therefore also return to a regular memory, or perhaps one would have no recollection of being in Eden once they had left it. According to the Tree of Souls, there exists the term Gan Eden, believed to mean Garden of Eden, but that it has two meanings, one referring to the earthly garden and one referring to spiritual paradise. In Jewish law, the two often blur into one, but there has been some later interpretations that suggest that there are two gardens, an earthly one where Adam and Eve once lived and a heavenly Eden found in paradise, one that all the righteous souls will return to. Whilst we've spoken a great deal about the cherubim guarding the way to Eden already, it might interest you to learn that there are mystical Jewish interpretations that suggest that these angels can admit souls of righteous people who have died, or souls of those whom the cherubim deem worthy. The Tree of Souls details this as being purified by the cherubim, giving us the impression that these angels have some sway over who is saved and who isn't. We are told, if they see a soul worthy of entering, they admit it, but if it is not, they drive it away, and it is punished by the flame of the ever-turning sword. In yet another Jewish myth, Alexander the Great once stopped by a stream to sip from the water. He found the water here to have been so refreshing that he was convinced the stream had to have flowed from the Garden of Eden itself. Following the stream to its source, he found himself at the gates of Eden, and here the gates were indeed guarded by an angel with a flaming sword. His company were terrified and hid from the angel. But Alexander stood before the being and demanded for the gates to have been opened for him. The angel sternly told him such a gateway was the gateway of the Lord, and that only the righteous would be admitted to enter. Realizing the angel would not let him pass, Alexander acquiesced and told the angel that he was a great king, and that if he would be denied entry, then at least he ought to have been given something. To this, the angel obliged him and gave him a human eye, which weighed more than all of his gold and silver. When he inquired how this could be, the angel told him that the eye of the human being is never satisfied, and that to prove this, he told Alexander to cover the eye with dust. When Alexander did this, the eye returned to its true weight. The moral Alexander gained from this little misadventure was that the lust of the human eye was limitless, but was just as easily quenched by dust or death. Alexander learns this at the gates of the Garden of Eden, the one place in the world he had no means to conquer, just as he had no means to conquer death. Thus, the moral of the tale is that there are built-in limits to the satisfaction of human desire, a moral that is appropriately directed at Alexander, whose thirst for conquering was shown to ultimately be unquenchable by anything other than death itself. Furthermore, from this, you might say that if one such as Alexander the Great was so easily humbled at the gates of Eden and denied entry by the angel who resides there, what possible chance would any regular believer have when trying to return to this paradise? Another Jewish legend suggests that there are inhabitants of Eden in the form of Abraham and his wife Sarah, who are the only two souls righteous enough to have been allowed back in. In this legend, Abraham is believed to gather leaves that have fallen from the tree of life. Sarah then crushes those leaves into a powder, which is then dispersed amongst the winds and scattered across every corner of the earth, so that all who breathe in and taste the powder can enjoy the smallest speck of paradise. The Garden of Eden is not just a place, but a lost possibility. Once described as a paradise overflowing with life and beauty, it now exists only in memory and scripture, a remnant of what humanity forfeited. The Bible makes it clear that a return was impossible, for the watchful cherubim made sure that mankind stayed well away. These then were not just guards of a garden, but symbols of a final divide between mankind and the perfection it once knew. Even in later visions and apocryphal tales, Eden remains unreachable, either submerged by the flood, hidden beyond mortal sight, or preserved in some higher realm. No hero, prophet, or conqueror ever finds it, with the exception of the likes of Alexander, and yet not even he is worthy enough to venture beyond the gates. Perhaps then it is not meant to be found. The story of Eden reminds us that there is no return to innocence once knowledge has been gained, no path back to the world before the fall. Whatever Eden was, it lies forever beyond the horizon, a paradise remembered, but never to be held. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.